Oh god, yeah.
Welcome to the first ever episode of the Between Buckets podcast. My name is Lucas Pearce, and for the very first time, I'm joined by my good friend and fellow basketball fanatic, Patrick Cross.
Exciting times, isn't it, Lucas? We've got a taste of the preseason. Now I'm just hungry for opening night.
I feel that, man. I really do. Today we have an incredible first show for you all. We're going to start by talking about the preseason, whether we put any meaning into it, some of our takes about the players that we've seen, and the teams, our predictions, and then finally we're going to finish by talking about something a lot closer to Australian soil, Lamelo Ball and how he's gone in the NBL, and his future for next year and the years beyond that. But first, let's hear from a quick plug.
If, like Lucas and myself, you enjoy a side dish of written analysis to go with the main meal, which is this podcast, then you should head to betweenbuckets.com. On the site, you'll find feature articles looking at topics such as Giannis's MVP defense, a critical year for Ben Simmons, and our top 25 player rankings heading into the 2019-20 season. Be sure to check it out, as there are some contentious names challenging conventional wisdom and some familiar faces in declining places. Also, be sure to follow Between Buckets on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more updates and analysis. Back to the pod.
So, Patrick, when you've watched the preseason this year, and obviously years before that, how do you approach it?
The preseason I've had an interesting sort of relationship and opinion of for a while now, but it is starting to evolve a little bit. I think my revert to tendency and feeling is that the preseason means nothing, and I think there is a lot of evidence supporting that. I mean, when you tune in for a bit of Tuesday basketball and you see Atlanta take it to one of the top teams, and teams are resting their superstar players, or they're playing less than 20 minutes. You're hearing guys' names that you haven't heard in years, and it looks like they're not really trying. It is difficult to get yourself in the mode of feeling that this means a whole lot when you see, if we're looking at this preseason, you've seen the Suns beat the Blazers and the T-Wolves, you've seen the Bulls beat the Raptors, you've seen the Pelicans beat the Jazz, and you think, what does this mean anything, you know?
So it does. The Bulls are an 8th seed finish.
That's 2 minutes in and there's already some Bulls conversation. But no, I think just looking at the preseason from that sort of fresh slate perspective, you think it's really difficult to prescribe any meaning to it.
Oh, no, I get where you're coming from. I think there are definitely larger aspects of the game that you really can't put much credence in. But I think there are definitely some, let's call them microcosms in the preseason that actually have some validity. For example, when we look at Zion, and obviously this isn't a surprise to anyone, but he has dominated physically. He has not only met the expectations for the type of physicality he was going to bring, but I think he's exceeded them. When you look at how he took it to Rudy Gobert with such efficiency and strength, he didn't seem deterred as he laid that ball in. And I think those small, minute factors definitely carry meaning going into the season, particularly around health and even maybe a player's presence in the game and their instincts.
Yeah, that's actually one thing I'm leaning into a bit more with in terms of evaluating the preseason and giving it some meaning, is looking at individual players and how they fare. And I think that's particularly relevant in the case of rookies such as Zion. You know, he's coming in with all this hype and pressure, and you need to see whether his 18, 19-year-old body is sort of up to the challenge of playing against these bigger, NBA veteran bodies. And one thing that's really stood out to me, just on the eye test of watching Zion, as you've mentioned, he really looks like he's matched that physicality. I mean, watching him evolve over the last few years, and you saw his high school mixtapes and all the flashy dunks, and you saw his college career. He was always so clearly the biggest, strongest, fastest guy on the court. And for me, there was a question mark going into the season. Like, I knew he was a phenomenal athlete. That's pretty undeniable. But I wasn't sure how that would fare against a legitimate NBA athlete, whether he would stand out as much. And in looking at the preseason, you're watching him play, it does. He is still the biggest, strongest, fastest guy on the court. He is, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting him to dominate physically like this to this extent. I mean, at the moment he's small sample size, I know, which is a problem with the preseason, which I'm sure we'll get to, but he's scoring 23 points, 6.5 boards, 71% shooting. He's got over a couple of steals a game, just about. He's doing this sort of strength and physicality, and he's getting to the paint and just scoring with that dominance that we saw at college. And so far in the preseason, it looks like it's translating straight away.
And I think the other core aspect of kind of the preseason and where it's conducive to figuring out where a player's at is their health. I think if you look at past seasons, Zach LaVine, as a Chicago Bulls fan, really comes to mind because that preseason he had post ACL and rehab was highly indicative of where he was at. He averaged 17.8 points a game, nearly 3 boards, and he shot a pretty convincing split on 51, 43, and 83%. And those numbers over 5 games obviously don't mean that much because, again, anything can happen. Players can have slumps and all of that. But the fact that he moved, the fact that he was looking for the ball, that he was aggressive, that he still had that explosiveness, all of that stood under the eye test.
And that's one of those things where the preseason is useful in that sense because you look at somebody coming off an injury, evaluating somebody's health, and in this case with Zach LaVine, he showed in the preseason that he can match it. He was back to what he was looking like, pre-ACL injury.
And it translated to his best season of his career.
So then you can look at the preseason like that and give it some credence. That's where I think there is some value in the preseason. And just touching on that subject of health, I thought this preseason, which is just about wrapping up, the biggest storyline, which actually turned out to be a fake storyline to me, was the whole Anthony Davis thumb injury. There was initial speculation that this could be reasonably serious and delay his debut. It was a 4 to 6 week injury that eventually got thrown out the window, and he ended up playing yesterday in the preseason game. But it served as a reminder that someone like Anthony Davis, his health is such a huge question mark. And in that sense, watching him not be able to get through 4 or 5 games in a preseason without an injury scare.
It was indicative to that week-by-week listing, really. With him, every Tuesday he could be out.
Exactly. He's on a permanent day-to-day medical diagnosis in a sense. And in terms of the preseason, it's just a strong reminder of something like that.
And I think when you move past, individual players and how they're looking, once you do that and you make that step, the preseason, I think, loses its relevancy. Because like you've already said, bad teams or historically bad teams over the last few seasons have beaten good competitive teams. And it's because the minutes are skewed. There's probably, I reckon, 15 to 20 minutes where the coaches actually care and they really invest in trying out new lineups. And beyond that, it is G League and bench rotational players indulging in the spotlight, I guess you could call it.
And you see coaches often like to throw out wacky lineups in the preseason. You've seen Philadelphia at times this preseason go to a full court press and teams use a bit of zone as well. And these are things that we're probably not going to see in the regular season, but coaches are just trying out these wacky moves. And it's like, how can you give any meaning to something like that when it's very unlikely to show up in the real regular season?
I think you learn more about a coach's personality in those type of quirky lineups than you do in any media interview because some of them are just outright funky.
That's one of the weird things in evaluating the preseason as well. I think it is, we prescribe this revisionist meaning to the preseason of when something works, like Zach LaVine coming back from injury and looking good, or say if Davis does have an injury-riddled season this year, we'll look back on this preseason and say, there was flashes of it in the preseason, and we can see this trend, and it began in the preseason, and then in that sense, we're giving the preseason credence and meaning after it. But then, if we look at something when it clearly doesn't work, then we write off the preseason as meaningless because, as we said, teams aren't playing their best players, coaches are using wacky lineups and techniques. And it's just one of those things where it's a double-edged sword of whether we give it meaning or we don't give it meaning.
There's a very fine line, as kind of we've talked about, where you assess something and have any faith in it, I guess. And there's heaps of players that have had really, really strong pre-seasons and then completely fallen apart in the regular season. And 2 examples that come to mind is James Ennis's rookie pre-season, where he came in and he averaged 14.5 points, 5 rebounds and 2 assists per game while shooting an incredible 52% from the floor and a 45.5% from long range.
And that is not translated to his regular season career.
Precisely. And he was proclaimed as this immediate steal. And when he entered the regular season and he was exposed to the NBA 48 minutes of intensity, the game pace, the fact that, the starters are not playing 15 to 20 minutes, they're playing 30 to 35, and most of them are trying to win the game. Once all those factors manifest, it really shapes some people's statistics. And another one, and if we want a big name, look at Derrick Rose when he came back after that first ACL tear. He, in the preseason, looked phenomenal. All of us Chicago Bulls fans were going, my goodness, he's back, he's returned. And he led the preseason in scoring, or he was up there. He dished out 5 assists. He shot an unbelievable 47% field goal percentage. And then he also shot 44 from 3-point land. And I think we were all going, did he work on it? Is this a new element of his game? And we all bought into that. And as we know, his body didn't hold up. And even in that 10-game stretch where he did play, he put up atrocious numbers. I think he averaged about 16 points, 4 assists, and 3 rebounds on an unbelievably awful 35% from the field, 34% from the 3-point line. And his free throw was obviously how it is because he's a guard. But beyond that, it was one of the worst 10-game stretches I'd ever seen. And I think it questions the degree of success one can have and how it really operates outside of factors in the preseason. And that once you get to the regular season, there's so much more that you kind of need to contend with.
Yeah, it's just one of those huge discrepancies where you can see someone's career, or season for that matter, take off in the preseason and continue and flow through. Or you can see there's examples where it's just the absolute opposite, and maybe they thrive in those weird conditions. And I think looking back at this preseason, one interesting case study which we'll look at going forward is this Carson Edwards explosion from the Boston Celtics.
That was incredible.
He hit 8 threes
6 minutes
in 6 minutes, which is incredible. But you're going to have, it seems it's such a divisive sort of moment because it'll have 2 camps, probably one filled with Boston stans and diehards saying, oh, this guy's got it. He's shown it. He's shown that he can go off. He can hit 8 threes in 6 minutes. But then you'll have the other camp saying, well, he did it against the Cavs in the preseason, and it'll show. Like when in a few months' time, or at the end of the season, we'll look back and say Carson Edwards has a good season shooting. Maybe he goes up a couple of times and hits a lot of threes. One camp will say, I was right. We saw this in the preseason. It's flowed on. But if he doesn't live up to this hype that he's kind of built himself off of 1 6-minute stretch, you'll have the other side saying, we were right. Preseason means nothing.
The only thing I really take away from something like that is the NBA has so much talent. And really, there are heaps of guys that could go off for a career night and hit 8 threes. And I'm not saying that Carson Edwards, I'm not saying he's not going to become an elite shooter or he doesn't have that in him. But really, at this point, I agree. I think there is so much, or there is so little, that a performance like that could speak to. And I think the only thing that it establishes is that the kid's hungry and the kid has talent. And whether or not that manifests is another question entirely. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break before we come back and talk about some of our takes from the preseason. This is a call out for watch enthusiasts everywhere. The Quick20 Network is growing and we now have our very own Watch Hobbies website. So head over and visit thenextwatch.com. That's THENXT watch.com. With a ton of reviews, features, and weekly columns on watches under 4 figures, thenextwatch.com has it all. So Patrick, after that incredibly complex discussion on the value of a preseason, what are some of your takes from watching players perform, or teams?
Yeah, it's interesting how we've just spent 10, 15 minutes talking about how the preseason can mean nothing or it can mean something. Now I'm going to make a case of why it can mean something. And one thing that stood out to me, which I'm buying, which I think is going to translate to the regular season, is looking at these Warriors games and just looking at this incredible offensive burden that Steph Curry's going to have to take going into this season for them to be relevant come playoff times. I think looking at their roster in the preseason and what they are going into the season, obviously we all know the big outs of Klay Thompson with his ACL, might not even come back this year, who knows, and obviously Kevin Durant. But this new sort of lineup that they've got, looking at these preseason games, they are going to struggle to initiate an offense. I think D'Angelo Russell was an underrated pickup for them, but I'm not sure how he fits into this pace space ball movement system that the Warriors run.
I was thinking about it today, actually, and I think what they're going to have to do is run the offense almost through D'Angelo Russell. Because think about it, Russell doesn't have the same catch and shoot ability as Steph. And I think Steph being obvious, like, I don't think there's any question in my eyes, he's the greatest shooter of all time.
Undeniably.
His catch and shoot statistics are phenomenal. And I think that if you're trying to maximize an offense with the talent that you have, and not necessarily your best player, but if you're trying to maximize and you're trying to play good basketball, D'Angelo Russell needs to be the spark plug. He needs to be able to set up that offense so that catch and shoot efficiency can translate to Steph. And we know Steph can run. He can run around 5 different defenders and then still hit a corner 3. What Steph will have to prove this season, I think, will cement in part his legacy. Because the beautiful efficiency that he's ascertained from players like Klay Thompson, the spacing that he's gotten from a second facilitator in Draymond Green and Andre Iguodala, these elements of his game that helped him create something that we hadn't seen before and was intrinsic in his MVP campaigns and successes, they're absent now. And I think this will be his rawest season. We will see how versatile a scorer he is. And I think that D'Angelo Russell plays a huge part in that, because if they do not use him correctly, because Russell is more limited offensively, I think he got to the line 2 times a game. So there's whole elements of his game that are absent. His drive to the bucket game just isn't there. And obviously he's not the same shooter.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how D'Angelo Russell is going to affect Steph Curry's game and vice versa, because I do think they have such distinct games, and they both, seemingly, as you say, like, D'Angelo Russell needs the ball in his hands to be effective, where Steph Curry can be effective off ball, running off screens, curling around for pull-up jump shots.
I think it's the only solution, really.
But that being said, if this team is to succeed at all, it's on the flip side, Curry has to have a phenomenal MVP-like year. I don't think D'Angelo Russell and spot up Steph Curry in the corner is going to be enough. And what we've seen, this narrative building from the preseason that I'm buying, is that this is kind of Steph's redemption year, that he's taken the back seat while Durant was there. His last season without him was obviously 2015-16, which is one of the most historically dominant individual seasons ever, in my opinion. But we've seen this narrative build in this preseason about how this is Steph's sort of comeback year. So we've seen Kerr come out with quotes, and quotes are always iffy. Everyone's looking fantastic this time of year. But Kerr's come out and say Steph's in his prime right now. His strength and conditioning is amazing. Defensively, he's seen everything that's come his way, and he's got counters for everything, and that he's in this sweet spot. That
I have so many.
He's getting some MVP hype, and like, it's quotes you can take with a grain of salt sometimes, but you can definitely see that this is really. I think the Warriors will go only as far as Steph can take them, and if we're looking at the preseason, he had one game against the T-Wolves and a 20-point win where he had 45 points in 25 minutes. Classic Steph efficiency, so it's 14 from 19 from the field, 6 of 9 from 3. He's got 6 boards, 6 assists, 2 steals, 1 block. I could go on and on. And I'm not saying that that's replicable on a nightly basis or that he's necessarily going to win the MVP. I wouldn't put my money on it personally. But I think it's an indicator of the kind of load that Steph is going to have to carry for this team in order to be successful. And if you look at the game where Steph took off yesterday against the Lakers, they looked empty. And I know that's being said, you could go into the whole, what does this preseason mean? But if we're just looking at this small sample size, they need Steph to be truly, truly dominant on the offensive end of the court.
I don't think that preseason has anything to do with this line of discourse. I think it's more common sense. They've lost so many of their key contributors that, yes, of course they're going to be hollow. Steph, there's just so many issues right now with what he can do for this team and what their end goal should be. If they're smart, they should be trying to develop something for next season, because like we've said, Klay's probably not going to come back this season. ACLs in the NBA have a history of either ruining a player's career trajectory or being an awful hurdle that you have to spend years getting over, not 8 or 9 months. And I think the other issue that we're not really talking about is the defense. The way that this team can currently beat its opponents is by outscoring them, because who stops someone on this team? They don't have a legitimate veteran defender or an effective defender at the moment outside of Draymond, and we know that some of these guards, some of these wing players are going to brutalize them on the wing. And there's just
it's true. Defensively, I think that they're really going to struggle. And you could tell even in that T-Wolves win, I said that they won by 20 points. But they kind of won ugly in the sense that Minnesota scored 123. I think it's really going to be a matter of whether Steph and D'Angelo Russell in particular, can they outscore opponents more so than can they keep competitive games? I think we're going to see a lot of score lines like this, where it might be a Warriors win 140 to 120 or vice versa in a loss. I think they're going to need to be a really high-scoring team because I don't think their defensive ceiling is high at all.
Do you think that Steph plays 75 games?
It's difficult to say. I think for them, if they have any chance of being a top 4 seed, which I would say it's a very slim chance personally, but I think if they were to do that, if he was to have an MVP-like season, I think he has to play in that ballpark. And his body hasn't shown a great history of doing that.
So to make the playoffs, they need to get over that 43 to 44 win projection. And I think they totally have the talent and the assets to do that. But it's more the question of if Steph is, as he has been these last few seasons, inconsistent with his health, does D'Angelo Russell have to go off for 50 to win a game where Steph Curry's not playing? And how many in that 10 to 15 games that maybe he misses, how many of those games can he go off for 50?
It's a difficult equation to like where these points are going to come from, especially when Steph's off the court. I think you're right. D'Angelo Russell has to take the next step up because you look at their depth chart and there's not a lot of scoring there. I mean, anyone expecting Draymond to have a huge leap in offensive production, at least in terms of scoring, I think is dreaming. Then suddenly you're relying on guys like McKinney, Looney, Burks, Jacob Evans, Cauley Stein. They're not really dominant offensive players.
What are you talking about? Cauley Stein's an absolute pro. I think
he's the role man.
He sends terror in his matchup.
Anyway, it'll just be really interesting to see if Steph is going to have this sort of MVP-like year, replicating that 2015-16 with all this pressure and burden that he's got, or whether it could go the other way. And I think they're a really big what-if team, and the preseason just shows that. What have you got, Lucas? What's your takeaway?
I think we should swing to the Eastern Conference and look at the Bucks and Philly. And my biggest takeaway is that it is a two-team race to the finals from the East. And I think it's interesting because I think the Bucks have a certain level of consistency. They have an identity. Sure, they lost Malcolm Brogdon, which we've both talked about previously, personally, about how it hasn't really even been appreciated. This guy was a 50-40-90 shooter last year, and I think his absence is going to affect them more so defensively than offensively, because I think they're going to be able to adjust and hand out, obviously, those shots, that usage rate. And Giannis just looks prepped for another great season, as he should be, being 25 this season.
And the reigning MVP.
And also there's, elements like mentally, I think he's really hungry after everything that they went through last season. I'm not worried about their offense. And I think Milwaukee is going to be a dominant force throughout the regular season. But interestingly, I think that their ceiling doesn't quite compare with that of Philadelphia. And the contrast there is fascinating because Philadelphia doesn't have the same consistency and the same identity, but they have more talent, and just their ceiling, I think, is higher because if they can perfect this Goliath lineup and their offensive rotations around it, they are just a walking mismatch for pretty much every team in the league. You have so many different options, and even some of their supporting cast, once you intermingle them, if you go smaller with Al Horford at the 5, there's so much they can do there. So I think with Philly now, I would say that they're probably my favorite going into the East. And after watching Al Horford just go through the motions even in preseason and the versatility, it was a humongous pickup for them.
Yeah, I agree. I think Philly are my pick to get out of the Eastern Conference as well, just because I think that ceiling is so much higher than Milwaukee's. I think Milwaukee is a safe bet. They're going to be really good. Giannis is going to dominate. I do think the Brogdon loss was significant, but I just think that this length and versatility in the different lineups that Philadelphia can throw at you, not to mention the fact that we haven't seen a fit Embiid yet. If he gets in shape, if we get a little bit of Ben Simmons jumper, the ceiling's through the roof, and I think it really is championship material.
Oh, definitely. And I think Ben Simmons really is the anchor here. If he makes that next step, even to a fraction of the degree that the team envisions, they become an animal that really, I mean, who else has 3 starting players that have the strength to match up with 3 6'9" plus guys? And they can literally field 4 of them that have phenomenal athleticism, that are explosive, and that have a variety of ways to punish you, be it in the paint or outside.
And I think I completely agree. I think the biggest thing that pops out to me when looking at this Philly team is this defensive potential is just incredible. I mean, there's so much hype about how big their starting lineup is, and that's true. But we look at Simmons, Richardson, Harris, Horford, and Embiid. That's a phenomenal defensive lineup with length, size, switchability, versatility. But one underrated thing, which I've been looking at in the preseason a little bit, is the rookie that they've picked up, Matisse Dible.
Huge
taken
pick.
20th at the draft, and I think he could be one of those quietly important figures, just because I don't think Philadelphia are a very deep team, to say the least. And his defensive numbers and presence in his college career and during the preseason so far have been phenomenal.
No, I think he could easily be one of the best defenders in the last few years. I think he's already what he's displayed on the wing is, I think, there's a conversation that he could be a top 5 wing defender at his position.
Yeah, his numbers are just incredible. And if we're going back to college here, he averaged 3.5 steals a game, over 2 blocks as a 6'5" guard. And if we're looking at the preseason, he showed that has potential to translate. He had 4 steals, 2 blocks in a preseason win versus Detroit. And his 3-point numbers have been up and down throughout his career, but he's got a nice looking stroke and he's flashed a bit of potential. He's just one of those players that could bump Philly up a little bit, especially if we're expecting some Embiid to take games off, which he should, or even to get injured. If you're to throw Horford at the 5, the question mark is who's that sort of 5th guy that you can throw in there? What kind of versatile lineup can Philly throw out? And I think someone like Matisse Dible has just shown so much potential on that defensive end that it adds to why Philadelphia are one of the more interesting teams going into the season.
It's those questions that you almost wonder if the Lakers asked, because we're talking about talent, we're talking about contention for a title, and Philly was incredibly clever in terms of who they've picked up and what they've surrounded this huge question mark with. But if we now look at the Lakers, I think they're a walking tightrope this season, because they have talent in 2 of what most people would agree on to be the top 5 players in the world. And yet that supporting cast, that rotation, and kind of who they lean on in either games where one of their 2 stars are resting or injured, there's huge holes really in terms of what you can surmise from where they're at.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Lakers are another one of those teams where the ceiling is so high, but the floor is deceptively low as well. And I know that's a pretty common feature coming into the preseason. There's a lot of what if surrounding teams. But I think if you're looking at the Western and Eastern Conference, there's certain teams which you can just lock in as being good and vying for top spots in their conference. But the Lakers are just one of those teams where I could see them being one of the, maybe top 3 seeds in the West. But I could also see them struggling. And I think that's because of that lack of depth that you mentioned. LeBron and AD are undeniably top 5 players. They're going to be fantastic when they're on the court. I don't think that's even up for discussion.
It's not a conversation.
It's the coldest take I can even throw out to you. But if we're looking at the rest of their lineup, it drops off.
You have Denny Green, who sure is a stud in the regular season when it comes to knocking down a high 3-point percentage. He's also a fantastic defender.
As a Spurs fan, I can attest to the fact that he can go absolutely missing it sometimes.
He can also apparently win himself contracts after finals games as well, though.
That helps, despite one of the worst turnovers of all time, but people have forgotten that because they won the championship.
But then we also look at Kuzma, who again, I don't think has proven himself to be a legitimate threat, really, even offensively. There's still questions in where he's going to go. Defensively, I think he's a liability. Rondo is, again, great at playing himself into a new contract when it really, really matters. But it's another year for Rondo, and I think the inconsistency is only going to be exacerbated by all of those factors. JaVale McGee, Dwight Howard. Now, it's crazy that those two names are the complementary starting piece to Anthony Davis.
If you said this a couple of years ago, that LeBron and Anthony Davis on the Lakers, and they're dependent on Dwight Howard and JaVale McGee to play critical roles.
Or Caldwell Pope. It's
just dumbfounding, isn't it? But one thing that I actually like the fact that they're throwing a big next to Anthony Davis. I think that's going to be a fundamental thing during the regular season, but ultimately I think you would agree that their peak crunch time lineup would have him at the center, just because I don't think JaVale and Dwight are playable in a late game situation.
It's fascinating now that we're entering a league that is so much closer to parity, that the necessity of depth has been so much more clear. No longer can you really rely on three really good players. It's more about the top end of your talent and how that can be complemented by reliable and effective pieces. And I just don't think the Lakers have it this year.
Yeah, and that's one of those interesting contrasts with the Clippers that they've got going on, is that usually in the past we've seen this sort of time of big threes, and those big threes have come at the expense of depth. And then intuitively you'd think, oh, okay, now we've got a big two, that means we can spend more money filling out this roster. And you look at the Clippers and you say you got your clear top two, you've got Kawhi and Paul George, and then they've got this nice supporting cast around them. We got guys like Williams, Montrezl Harrell, potentially Iguodala coming in. You got Pat Beverly. You've got nice pieces there, but then you look at this Lakers roster and you see you've got two absolute stars. I like Danny Green. Avery Bradley's shown some flashes, but has been quiet this last couple of years. And then it's just pretty barren. So it'll be really interesting to see whether the excellence and the peak, which is the LeBron and Davis combination, can sort of make up for that and make them look a lot better than they are, or whether that depth question is going to come back and hurt them.
When we talk about the Lakers and the state of their roster, part of that is the unsung strategy of Kawhi Leonard. There's a reason they couldn't get anyone else, because he waited so long before he made his decision.
He burnt their off-season. Really,
he started competing for a championship weeks before he even thought about this regular season. It was just unprecedented, really.
He's the Kaiser Soze of the NBA.
He may well be. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to go to our fun fact guy.
Today's fun fact is on former NBA spark plug Nate Robinson. Listed at 5'9" and 181 pounds, Robinson is one of the shortest players to ever play in the NBA. And yet despite this, he suited up for 14 seasons in his career. What's equally, if not more impressive, is that Robinson is the only person to ever win 3 slam dunk championships. In his first contest, Robinson closed out his competition by dunking over 80s dunk legend Spud Webb. In his next victory, he donned the famous Kryptonite shoes and beat out Dwight Howard's Superman effort. And in his final victory, he won 51% of the audience's vote against DeMar DeRozan. Boasting a 43.5-inch vertical and the fastest three-quarter sprint ever recorded at a draft combine, it's easy to understand why Robinson was capable of explosive scoring outings throughout his career. Back to you, boys.
Now, Patrick, it is with great excitement that I steer the conversation back to Australian soil, and we talk about Lamelo Ball and his time in the NBL and some of your first impressions.
First impressions are the Ball family have lived up to the hype in terms of this rollercoaster experience of unpredictability and highs and lows. Like you, I'm a shameful, guilty pleasure binge watcher of Ball in the Family.
I'm not even ashamed, though. I was horrified when the Emmys did not give them a nomination.
It is hard not to be hooked into this lifestyle that LeVar Ball is propagating.
He's delivered, though. I mean, look at what LaMelo is. Look at the hype around him. You can't tell me that this has all been a fluke. There is a weird kind of arbitrary genius to the whole thing.
There definitely is. If we want to go a bit outside basketball here, I think he's the Chris Jenner of the NBA.
Easily.
And that's sort of family dynasty, and it's working. But if we want to take a flip away from keeping up with the Kardashians...
What, do you want to get back into basketball?
Yeah, it is low-key the title of the podcast. But if we're looking at on the court, if you haven't been paying a lot of attention to him so far, I'll read you out his basic stat lines. Across 3 games, which have been 2 losses and a win, he's got 12 points, 5 boards, 5 assists, but the inefficiency has sort of been there. He's shooting 37% from the field. Across the 3 games, he's 1 for 13 from 3, 7%, and 64% from the free throw line. But he does have 2.5 steals, and that's in about 30 minutes a game, and he's second in the league in assists. So just looking at those, the sort of highs and the lows have really popped out to me.
It's fascinating that there doesn't seem to be a single ball brother that can shoot the ball.
No.
But
I don't know what he was teaching them growing up.
But at the same time, I think that percentage should really increase because he's adapted to a system that is so much more comprehensive than anything he's ever played in before. And beyond that, it's a different pace. Lamelo likes to play fast, and that's something that has often been a source of praise for him. But the way that the NBL is played and the way that even in Australia, the way that we're taught to play, we like to share the ball and we love to progress the ball and find that best shot. And I think there are definitely elements in Lamelo Ball's game that are definitely going to take time to adjust. He has struggled, I think, in getting used to the utilitarian nature of some of the offensive sets that his team is indulging in. And I think once that mellows out and he's reconciled it, pun intended, he really should improve in some of these areas that we've cited. And that's obviously, selection will always be a thing with Melo, I think, and I don't know if it'll be a dramatic improvement, but it wouldn't surprise me if those numbers hovered above the 40% mark by the end of his tenure in the NBL.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. I think I agree with you in that in some respects he sort of feels like he's really acclimatized himself to this Australian brand of basketball. As he said, we like to share the ball, and that's a strength of his. 5 assists a game, second in the league. And his vision and IQ and feel for the game in some respects, like his passing, especially in transition, has been incredible.
It's been unanticipated. I never knew he was capable of half of the playmaking talent that he's exhibiting.
No, there was, for example, like in that game 2 versus Perth, there was this pass to Josh Boone just in transition that on first look, it didn't look like much, but as you go back and watch it 2 or 3 times, it was just a pass that no one was expecting, no one was looking for. It was something that only you could clearly see it was one of those things that only he saw, and it was just a pass in transition that ended up leading to 2 points over the top of everyone's head. But it was just a small example like that to show me that he's got a feel for the game. But with that being said, though, the flip side of that coin, where I don't think he's really adjusted yet to this Australian brand of basketball, is this hard-nosed attention to detail on defense. And I think there's been a few times there where his defensive coverage and lapses is led to him being scored a lot on, and especially if he were, when he does progress to the NBA, if that kind of those lapses progress, that's going to be a big problem for him going forward.
It's interesting, but I think it's a technical issue because another thing that really surprised me about Lamelo and what he can do now is his explosiveness. The way that he moves, the coordination, the body control, the way he can even get up and dunk that ball was something I didn't think he would inherit from Lonzo. I thought Lonzo would always be an echelon above him in terms of athleticism and explosiveness. But he's there. He's right there. And I think he thus has the potential with his length and speed to be a solid, if not superior defender. And I think it is, again, maybe it's a youth thing. Maybe it's a byproduct of the fact that he knows he has talent that really no one else can contend with on an NBL hardwood floor. So I think a lot of it is still, he is only 18 as well. A lot of it
That's the common denominator in this evaluation. He's 18 years old.
Exactly. It is this journey to really improving as a basketball player and rounding out his game. And I think that is why it was so clever for him to play in a league like the NBL, because the fundamentals are still emphasized here.
Definitely. And just back on that defense again, despite that being said, despite these momentary lapses, he has shown there's examples of really good instincts there. I imagine you remember it as one of his highlight plays in Game 1 versus Brisbane, where he was just switched on and he stole the ball off an inbound pass and then just launched into a jam. And it was just another one of those head-scratching plays that you don't see many guys make. And you could see that he's got these basketball instincts to make incredible plays like that. It's just whether over the course of the season and in his development, can he sort of modest himself a little bit on the defensive end. There's too many steals that he's trying to make that when they don't pay off, he's getting burnt. And against superior athletes, once he gets to the NBA, against more advanced offense and skillful players, if that were to continue, he's going to get killed for it.
So with all this talk of the NBA, how do you see his status as a prospect changing or solidifying after this very brief sample size in the NBL?
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things. I think he's definitely, so far, like, you can overall call this, NBL experiment, if you will, a success, because I think his draft stock has definitely increased. But I think going forward across the season, if those shooting numbers don't lift, I think there's going to start to become a tipping point where there's more questions raised than highlight plays shown. We all know how important the shooting skills are, and he's not the Ben Simmons type athlete or prodigy that can get away with not shooting at all. He's going to need to have some sort of a jump shot to be effective in the NBA.
For the record, Ben Simmons can't get away with it either, but that's for another time.
He can't. That's, I almost launched into a full-on Ben Simmons tangent rant right there, but I will be mature and hold myself in.
I agree with this idea that, if the shooting doesn't improve and that question mark isn't answered, there may well be some detriment in terms of where he falls in the lottery. But I think really his name is now in that conversation. I don't think he goes number one. And if we look at the journey in terms of mock draft reports being released, even in the last 6 months, and initially he has really hovered around that 5 to 7 mark. And I think there are whole segments now being done all over the media, and there are whole articles being written about why he's now in contention for that number one pick. And whilst I don't think he's there, because I think James Wiseman and Anthony Edwards both have a more promising, a more solidified and rounded out game for their respective positions and are stronger candidates for those higher picks, I think there's an easy chance that he now goes for a 3rd to 4th pick. And that is an excess. You're 100% correct in that department. He's made more noise than RJ Hampton, and his physicality has been there. And I think that was another question. He has presented himself as this athlete that's still growing, by the way, and can really play with, men, full-grown men. And that was one of the questions orbiting around Melo as he started this season.
Yeah, and going forward with looking at the rest of his NBL season with the Hawks, I think it's going to be really interesting whether he gets to a point where he's satisfied, where his draft stock has risen into that higher echelon conversation, and whether he even does something like withdrawing from the NBL halfway through the season, which I think is a definite possibility. Because I think the Hawks are a young team, and not many are predicting them to be in the mix come playoff times. And there's risk keeping on playing on. Obviously, you've got the risk that he might injure himself, but also you've got the risk that something like his lack of a jumper and his inefficiency will start to, compound over time, and whether they'll become a bigger and bigger issue. And whether it will be better in his career interest to pull the plug halfway through, I don't think that's off the table.
No, outside of Aaron Brooks and AJ Ogilvy, it is really a team that lacks some experience and that I think will just hover around that mid-mark in the standings. So I think you're 100% justified in thinking there's this chance that he withdraws. And whilst I personally, like I did when there was talk of Zion withdrawing, detest the notion, I think it's totally understandable and it's quite possible.
Yeah, like personally, I obviously don't want him to, and I don't think he should. I think he could get a lot out of a continued season in the NBL, but I think there's that LeVar Ball factor again, that it's a business.
It is
for
a
them
business
at the end of the day, and his ultimate mission for this season, quite frankly, was probably to increase his draft
and he
stock.
has succeeded wonderfully.
Do you think exactly? Do you think how much do the Bulls care about the Hawks' playoff success?
I don't know if they're overly concerned. Let's just put it that way.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
100%. Anyway, my friend, that's all the time we have for today.
Been a pleasure.
As always.
Catch you later.